Thanks. I want to thank you for inviting me to talk about my images combining landscape astrophotos with stereoscopy. And today I'm going to give you an overview of some of the resulting images and of my process. First, these are the twins, Lita and Rita. They're my pair of stereo mirrorless camera. They're Sony a6000s, and along with a sturdy tripod, an intervalometer, wide-angle lenses, and a few indispensable apps, I shoot multiple long exposure images, which are then stacked together and aligned to hopefully reveal what I've imagined. And the next slide will show you that some of my astro images are really not suitable for 3D. For example, this image of the Milky Way over the Cerro Pedernal, there's no foreground element, and the subject of the photograph is too distant to have any meaningful depth. So with this type of image, I wouldn't even try. And while it's certainly possible to make stereo views of the moon and others make wonderful ones, I don't have the patience to wait for months and months or even years for the appropriate aspect for the second image. So I leave that to others. In the spring of 2021, I learned to create star trails. And once the cameras are set up and running, there is a long time to think. When I finished this image with my DSLR, I could really see, though, that there was potential for depth. And I wondered how I could incorporate stereo foregrounds as I captured the exposures. Before we dive further into the imaging, here's some quick notes about some apps that I use. From planning where to set up, to figuring out what time to start imaging, determining the angles and degrees of the location of the celestial objects, I highly recommend a phone app called PhotoPills. I'm only using a tiny fraction of its capabilities yet, but I love and depend on it. Because what you see with your eyes is not what you're actually imaging with your cameras. Among the features that I rely on with PhotoPills is Night AR, or augmented reality. And that allows me to compose my images so what I want in the sky is aligned with the rest of the composition. Here in this screenshot, it shows where Polaris and the star trails will be when it becomes dark and the stars appear in relation to this north-facing dock. The Night AR can also tell me where and on what date and time the Milky Way or other targets will rise above the horizon. Because the Earth's spinning and the stars are not stationary, knowing when and where things will be happening is very important. Once I download the multiple images exposed on each camera, I need to stack them together to create a composite for each side. There are a number of programs that do this, and I use a free Windows-based app called Sequator. Like Stereo Photo Maker, there are a number of options. It's a lot of trial and error. These next series of photos are each a single exposure as captured by one of the twins. In this instance, I had set up the rig to continuously shoot 30-second exposures for an hour and a half. This allows the sensor to gather the light while also allowing the stars to move a little in each image, rather than being remaining pinpoints like you would often want them to be. The tails are a little elongated. When cars drove by on the road behind me, the headlights or the taillights spilled into my shots. And when that first started happening, it was very frustrating. But that stray light can actually be very useful. I also sometimes use gelled flashlights or a color light wand to paint and illuminate parts of the foreground. And when combined with the unintentional light spillage, this can sometimes work in your favor, and when stacked, yield lovely illuminated scenes. After you stack the right and left side images and then run the composites through Stereo Photo Maker, this is the very first stereo star trails I ever attempted. The foreground work, the sky, not so much. The star trails rendered differently between the sides for some reason. It might have been a setting mismatch in the cameras. It might have been Sequator's algorithms stacking the images for each camera a little differently. I couldn't figure it out. And again, I was very frustrated. I spent some time recalibrating the cameras and tinkering with the stacking app. And I was speaking with a friend one day, months later, who suggested a possible solution. I ran the stereo back through Stereo Photo Maker and cloned out the sky. The background should have no depth anyway, and it was a brilliant yet simple fix for which I'm very grateful. And that's what that looks like. To keep all the variables to a minimum, during my early attempts with adding the stereo foregrounds, I used the same location, which became my lab. I returned several different times, trying different camera settings and exposure durations and other settings. And that will be there in the next one. I did that during the meteor shower, I think right below the 3D Con a couple of years ago. And all the while, spring became summer, and I remembered that you might know who was looking over my shoulder. So I turned the twins around and told them to have at it. And that's the resulting stereo. Later, I got sort of bored with this one location, so I went in search of other places to shoot. And I learned sometimes that the sky cooperates, but the play of the light and shadow on the foreground doesn't. After trying to work with these composite photos, I found one single matching exposure in the stacks from each camera to edit, rather than try and deal with the rivalries on the light on the building. This is from February of this year, and it features the dark end of the Milky Way. A friend also identified the bright object over the left side of the roof as the Andromeda Galaxy, and it's not much more than a faint smudge in this picture, which is very wide angle, but I could see its shape and that it was plainly there, and I found that detail really thrilled me to be able to capture that myself with my little cameras. An hour further to the west is Enchanted Rock, a large granite batholith that rises up out of the Texas Hill Country. The area is a target-rich environment for photography, and I spend a lot of time there. On this day, I scrambled up a large boulder with my camera pack and found this place to set up. It took a while to level the camera and make sure that my horizon was horizontal, and it doesn't look like it is there, but there's a lot of levels on the cameras themselves and on the rig that helped me do that. Here's that night's work from the twins, a little more than 2 hours worth of exposures at a minute each. The color is adjusted here to the warm yellow end of the spectrum in homage to the sweltering daytime temperatures we'd been having. Here's another slightly more realistic treatment of the same image. This is actually close to how the foreground appeared in the dark, black sprinkled with gold flecks. Then, yondering westward from Texas to New Mexico, I visited the San Augustine Plains west of Socorro. It's the home to the VLA, which is the very large array of radio telescopes. I love that place. It feels magical to be there. When I was there last October, it was still closed due to COVID, but there is a highway that bisects the array with a sizable pullout. And so we pulled out and set up there. It was right before sunset. This was my setup for the evening. I was shooting with the twins and my DSLR back to back, one facing north for the star trails and one facing south for the Milky Way. Initially, the Canon pointed north, and I captured this next shot at sunset with my telephoto lens. I was very excited for the trails I was going to capture with this composition. But I switched the cameras out about halfway through the evening because there were too many ground lights on the south muddying the Milky Way shots for the twins. So I decided they would take on the telescope and Polaris with their wide angle lenses. Polaris is a little bit higher in the sky there than it is at home, so I needed to compensate to get it into the shot by shooting from closer to the ground and aiming up a bit. This test image shows what that when you're shooting across a highway, you're going to get headlights streaming across your foreground element if you're not careful. So after some swearing and nudging, I found a pleasing angle for this trippy stereo. And clearly I'm speaking too quickly. There's the stereo. I want to call your attention in this shot to the near complete lack of light pollution on the horizon here. The skies are very, very dark, Bortle class 1. The stars seem more numerable or more innumerable than usual, and the sky is just inky black. The next image that you'll see is from Inks Lake, which is back in Texas, northwest of Austin. Banks of clouds rolled in and out over the course of the evening, alternately hiding and revealing the stars, and it made for some interesting star trails. While the skies become darker the further west you travel from Austin, to the east, light pollution becomes more pronounced. Wisps of occasional clouds are illuminated by the light from the city, which is an hour to the west. Also, at the bottom of this hill is one of those gas stations with a couple of dozen gas pumps spewing way too much light into the sky. Over a half-mile away, the light painted the front of the trees and the fence high above on this hill where I was, and contributed to an overall brightening of the sky. This is all ambient light. Now, the final locations I'll share with you are from Pedernales Falls State Park. Here, in partnership with the Austin Astronomical Society, public star parties are held, and members bring their telescopes and set up for the evening and introduce the public to stargazing. Also, member-only star parties are held there, and we're allowed to use this field on our own when it's not otherwise reserved. It's where I'm learning more about astronomy, and it's exactly 1 hour's drive from my house, so it's very convenient. I first visited a couple of days after the vernal equinox, and the sunset is still pretty much aligned with the obelisk, casting its shadow right down the walkway to the eastern entrance of this modern-day henge. Standing to the south of the obelisk, a meter or so away, and looking 30 degrees above the horizon, one can sight Polaris through the hole drilled through the obelisk. I could see it when standing, but forgot to compensate for the cameras being a little bit lower than my eye line, a mistake I won't make next time. I set the twins up to run for a few hours and then left them alone in order to get my other camera out to practice shooting Milky Way panoramas. This is the stereo image that the twins gifted me. Oddly, in the same field stands the remains of a single gnarly old tree a dozen yards or so beyond the henge. And who am I to pass up a tree stereo? So I drove back the following week and I had the field all to myself. Using photo pills, I identified the location of the North Star for my setup. And during the hour of twilight after sunset, the sky fills with some beautiful colors. And I'm not one to waste light, so I pinched off a few exposures with the twins after I finished prepping them for the stars. That way I could use them in the stacks and add some of the color back in. I set my light wand to amber and made a few short passes to the side to illuminate the side of the tree and the grass in the foreground to balance the light and add dimension and depth. To date, I think this is one of my favorite stereo star images I've done. Capturing these images of the night sky and incorporating stereo photography has been and is challenging and enjoyable. And every time I yonder out, I figure out something new and realize how much more there is still for me to learn about both stereo photography and astrophotography. And with that, I conclude. Thank you for listening.